In today's video, I would like to talk about two new plugins that merge the worlds of hardware emulation and immersive audio. And the way they do that is actually fairly ingenious, but I do have a couple of thoughts. So let's get started. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. If any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And since you already added, also please don't forget to press the like button. It really helps out the channel and makes my videos more visible to other people. Thank you. The plugins I want to talk about today come from a developer called Red Rock Sound. They actually have a number of really interesting plugins, but the two that are mainly interesting in the context of immersive audio are, on one hand, an emulation of a British Class A compressor, and that's the one that we are going to focus on today. And then they also have an emulation of a Pultec passive EQ, which works in pretty much exactly the same way. So we're going to look primarily on the compressor today, but the EQ is equally interesting. Before I continue, there are two things I need to make clear. The first one is that this is not a sponsored video, so I actually purchased these plugins myself. Nobody told me what to say, and nobody's going to see this before it's going to be released. And the second thing is that because I'm not really a professional audio engineer, I'm not going to talk too much about the quality of the emulation. I have no experience with working with these hardware units myself, but what I have experience with is the usability and how we can actually utilize these types of plugins within an immersive audio context. So I'm going to primarily focus on how we use them in immersive audio, and I invite you to check them out yourself. And if you are an audio engineer, I would actually like to hear from you if these plugins actually do a good job in emulating the hardware units, because that's once again something that I'm not going to focus on today. The project that I'm going to work with today is once again a very simple Cubase project. Now I'm going to work on a Mac today, but everything that I'm going to say works in exactly the same way on Windows, and you also don't need to have Cubase. Any digital audio workstation actually works fine. Now the project here is exactly the same project that I used last week. It's essentially a very simple MIDI loop that sits on a track with an instant of tune. So let me just kind of play that quickly. Now, the first thing that I want to demonstrate is that if you're working with plugins in a multi-channel setup, you actually need to consider how the plugins affect the three-dimensional nature of your sound. And in order to kind of see what I mean by that, let me just first do a very, very simple demonstration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a 7.1 group track here, and I'm going to route the synth into this group track. So let me just call the track test. And let me just route that into that track here. So here we have the group test. And then let me just move the synth back a little, just so that we have a little bit of three-dimensionality. So just a tiny bit. And that will essentially ensure that we have signal coming in not only from left and right channel, but also from the left and right surround speakers. And let me just see if everything sounds correctly. And here essentially see we have signal here, left, right speaker, and left surround, right surround. Now let's say I want to put a limit on the track, and for this purpose what I'm going to do now is I'm going to simply take the FAB filter limiter, because that's one that can actually handle 7.1 audio. So let me go back into the 7.1 track here, and let's just add an instance of FAB filter Pro L. So here we have FAB filter Pro L. And that's a nice one once again, because it can actually handle multi-channel. And in order to make sure that we are not going deaf, I probably need to kind of turn down the output signal quite a bit. So let me just kind of play that signal again. Let me maybe turn that down even more than that. So here I essentially have the left and right signal, and I have the two surround signals. Now what happens now if I push the limiter? So let me just push that up. You will essentially see that it will almost equalize the gain that's coming out of the surround speakers as opposed to the left and right speakers. And the effect that essentially has is that the signal will actually move backwards. So when we are applying plugins into an immersive audio signal, we need to be aware that these plugins can actually affect the three-dimensionality of your sound, and can actually change where the sound is coming from. Now, if you're working with surround sound, one of the recommendations usually is that, especially if you're using compression, you should only use compression lightly. And there are a couple of reasons why you want to do that. But one of those reasons, once again, is that if you are compressing too much, you will actually kind of change where the sound is coming from. And depending on how you set up your soundscape, that may actually have negative effects. So for example, if you have a traditional movie production where most of the sound is coming from the front speakers, and you have a little bit of effects going on in the surround speakers, and then essentially you compress the signal too much, then the effects will actually overpower what is coming from the front speaker. So you need to be very, very careful how you apply effects in an immersive audio setting. Now, one way to get around that is by compressing the signal that is coming out of the front speakers differently to the signal that is coming out of the surround speakers, for example. Now, there are a couple of plugins that allow you to do that. Most noticeably, there's a compressor from Mac DSP that can do that up to 5.1 channel, I believe. And I also kind of already talked about Wave Spherics and the PSP Oral Control that allow you to do similar things. However, there are very little plugins that are actually able to do that natively. And the plugins today are two plugins that actually approach that in a very interesting way that is very usable and very unique. And I wish more plugin developers would actually do it that way. So let's go back into our little project. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to simply delete that group track here. We don't need it anymore. And I'm going to instead add a 7.1.2 track. So let's assume, for example, that we are working in a Dolby Atmos project and we want to add an Atmos bed. And an Atmos bed, as you know, it would be a 7.1.2 track. Now, if you are not familiar with Dolby Atmos, for the purpose of this video, it doesn't make any difference. If you want to know more about Dolby Atmos and how to work with Dolby Atmos in Cubase in particular, I have a video and I post a link in the description below where you can learn about how to actually use Dolby Atmos in Cubase. But for this demonstration, I'm simply going to add one track that could serve as an Atmos bed. So let's just add that here. And we are not really going to route that into the Dolby renderer. We're just going to use it as a 7.1.2 track. And once again, let me just route the synth into that 7.1.2 Atmos bed track. And let's move the signal a little bit. So let's just maybe kind of move it back once again a little bit. And then since we are now also have 8 speakers, we actually can also move it into the vertical direction. So let's just move that up a little. And let's just play the signal again. I probably need to bring the gain back up. So let's see if we can compress that in a smarter way. And for that purpose, we're going to use the Red Rock Sound compressor. So let's open up the bed track here and let's just add an instance of the compressor, the RRS compressor 609. Once again, that is a British Class A emulation here. And once that comes up, we actually are greeted with a very interesting interface. So once again, I'm not going to talk too much about the nature of the emulation here, because once again, I'm not a professional audio engineer, so I need to be careful about what I'm saying and kind of so that I'm not overstepping my boundaries and kind of talking about things that I don't really know about. But the one thing I can talk about, and that's actually where my expertise is how applicable that plugin is in an immersive audio context. So let's just have a look on how to actually use that in immersive audio. Now, the key is really in the top section of this plugin, which defines how the individual channels are affected by the compressor. And in order to set that up, what we first need to do is we need to first kind of select the input routing. Now, this is a plugin that lives on a 7.1.2 track, so we want to set that to 7.1.2. As you can see, we have lots of different options here, but this is essentially a 10-channel track, so we have 7.1.2 here. As soon as I do that, I see the individual channels that I can select. I can select left channel, right channel, center channel, LFE channel, the side channels or the top channels, and I can either kind of turn them on or turn them off. And the idea is that this compressor is now going to act only on those channels that are selected. Now, this by itself would already be pretty nice, but the plugin has one additional trick up his sleeve, and that is that it is actually not only one compressor, it's actually a series of 4 compressors in sequence. And we can set these channels individually for each of those 4 compressors. So what we can do, for example, is we can say that left and right channel are kind of affected by the first compressor, and then in the second compressor we only affect the center channel. Or in the fourth compressor we're only going to affect the side channels, or in the fourth compressor we're only going to affect the top channels. So this now allows us to adjust the compression settings for these individual channels individually. So let's just have a listen on what we can do. So for example, now currently we don't really have any information in the center channel, so we only have information in the side channels. So what we can do, for example, in the third kind of compressor, which is responsible for the side channels, we can, for example, change the makeup gain and make the side channels more visible, kind of change the threshold and compress that individually. Then maybe go back to the left and right channels and set, maybe let's kind of change the makeup gain slightly, kind of make it a little quieter. Once again, change the threshold, maybe the ratio. Now this is really fairly ingenious because this allows you to now adjust the settings for each channel individually and work with the plugin in a way that is much more appropriate for immersive audio. And it also allows us to do one thing that follows up on my last week's video where I showed you how to use ambisonics in order to do some advanced mid-side processing in a 3-dimensional space, because we can now do that trick with that particular plugin as well. Now, if you have not seen that video, I invite you to watch that. I leave a link in the description below. The basic idea was that the first order ambisonics channel are really the side channels. So that's a 3-dimensional side signal, and we can actually use that in order to generalize the mid-side processing paradigm. Once again, if you are interested in these kind of applications, video link is in the description below. But here what we are simply going to do is I'm simply going to replace the 7.1.2 track. So let me just close that here and let's just delete that track. And I'm going to replace that with a first order ambisonics track. So let's add a group track here. Let's make that a first order ambisonics track. Let's call that ambisonics. And let's add that track. And then let's route the stereo signal into that ambisonics track so that we actually have some information. And then once again, let's move the signal a little bit to the back and maybe a little bit upwards, so that we have a signal that is a little bit more 3-dimensional. So let's just listen again how that sounds. So I probably need to bring the gain up back a little. Now we now have a first order ambisonic signal, and once again in a first order ambisonic signal, the first channel is the mid channel and the other 4 channels are the side channels in the 3 dimensions of space. So what we can now do is we can use our plugin in order to compress the ambisonic signal in a way that compresses the 3 side channels differently than the mid channel. So let's just do that here. So I'm going to open up the channel settings again, and let's open up the RRS, the RRS compressor here. Here we are. And in order to be able to do that, what we need to, first of all, we need to select the appropriate routing option. And we can do, it doesn't really make any difference, quite frankly. It can be any of those 4 channel settings. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply select the multi option here. And that essentially gives me access to the 4 individual channels. So the way this now works is that I want to have the mid channel in the first compressor and the second compressor be responsible for the side channel. So the first compressor is only going to compress the first channel, and the second one is going to compress the 2, 3, and 4. And let's just kind of play around with it a little. So let's play the thing again. So once again, the second, third, and fourth channel are the side channels. So if I'm bringing them up, I'm going to increase the spatial nature of my sound. So I'm going to make it wider. And conversely, if I'm doing the same thing, I'm going to the first compressor that's responsible for the mid channel. If I bring that down, I essentially kind of widen up the space in all 3 dimensions. So this plugin is actually capable of doing what we talked about last week, and you can actually use this plugin in order to compress the a 3-dimensional signal in a mid-side way, in exactly the way we talked about last week. Now, in addition to the compressor, they also offer a Pultic EQ emulation that works in exactly the same way. So let me just show you how that looks and how that works. So let's just close that here. And in addition to this compressor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, on this Ambisonics track, I'm going to add an instance of the Pultic EQ. And same thing as with the compressor, all the magic is happening here in the routing section. I'm going to select the same type of routing, which in this case was kind of the multi-routing here. And I'm going to do the same thing that I also did for the compressor. So the first equalizer is going to be responsible only for the first channel, which once again is the mid channel or the mono channel in the ambisonic signal. And the second equalizer is then responsible for the channels 2, 3, and 4. Which are the side channels or the first order ambisonics channels. And then we can do the very same thing that we did last week, playing around with the EQ settings in the sides as opposed to the mono signal. So let's just kind of make a couple of adjustments. So I can, for example, boost on the side channels, boost the higher frequencies, and maybe conversely on the mono channel boost the lower frequencies, and to do all kinds of things that I normally do with the Pultic EQ. So this is really fairly ingenious. So I really like the way they set up the routing options here and the way they allow you to use these plugins in multi-channel setups where the plugin actually affects the different channels differently. Very convenient to use, very straightforward to use. I wish more plugin developers would follow that kind of particular approach because I think it's really, really, really useful for anybody who is working in three-dimensional audio. Now, with all my excitement about these plugins, there's one thing I do not like, and that is how they actually work with third-order ambisonics audio. And I wish kind of the plugin developers would have thought about these things a little bit more carefully, because I don't think the third-order ambisonics option is particularly useful. So let me show what I mean by that. And in order to kind of do that, what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to kind of, let me just kind of delete that here. And let's just add a third order ambisonics track in order to kind of demonstrate what I mean. So let's add third order ambisonics and in order to kind of make sure that we have a signal, let's just kind of route that here. And all I'm really going to do is I'm going to add an instance of one of the plugins. Let me just kind of add an instance of the EQ maybe. And now if I have a third order ambisonic signal, which essentially means that I have 16 channels, I can essentially kind of change that to any settings that I want. But the one thing that sort of is really the only thing that is useful for ambisonics would be the 16 channel multi settings here. And the problem really is that in this particular settings, what they have done is they have grouped pairs of channels. So they have grouped 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so forth. And while this seems to be straightforward and something that seems kind of natural to do, really, it actually turns out to be particularly useless for ambisonics audio. And the reason for that is because, for example, if you're looking at channels 9 and 10, 9 and 10 are essentially the last channel of the second order ambisonic signal, and 10 is the first channel of the third order ambisonic signal. So grouping then makes absolutely no sense. So I wish the plugin developer would group them differently, and if I would make a recommendation, or if I can make a recommendation, the way I would actually group them is according to order. So I would essentially have one button here for the first channel, then one button for the first order channels, which are 2, 3, and 4, then one button for the second order channels, and one button for the third order channels. So maybe if the plugin developer is listening or watching this video, I would really kind of think that would be a useful addition to your plugin. Otherwise, everything is working perfectly, and I really like what you're doing. Now, this is really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching my videos. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below, or once again, join my Discord community. Invert link is in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.